Welcome to Sartor TV, an idea-sharing platform founded by Russell Sartor, who's an author, investor, and the CEO of Netcom Learning and AI Certs. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jeff Hull, an executive coach and co-author of The Science of Leadership. The book translates decades of global research into 9 practical leadership capacities, and Jeff is here to tell us more. Jeff, thank you so much for being here today.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and your career journey, how you got to where you are today.
Well, like everyone else who's had a 30-year career, it's been a meandering journey, but I'm very grateful for all the ups and downs along the way. I started out in New England. I grew up near Boston and went to college in that Boston area and ended up in New York in the field of HR. So I worked as a director of HR for a big consulting firm for a few years. And that's where I cut my teeth on coaching. I started working as part of my role, just coaching the consultants and the partners. But I learned early on that I was not skilled at doing that. Even though I had taken some psych courses, I was not very well prepared. So I took some time off, went back to school, got a PhD in psychology. And then this was in New York. I went ahead and went through the process of becoming a licensed psychotherapist. And I did that for a few years. Incredibly valuable experience working with people. In order to become a psychologist, you have to do your own work. You have to have a therapist. And so it was a very valuable experience. But the long story short is that having worked in the corporate world, I was very results oriented, and I was maybe a little impatient for therapy. I thought it was valuable, but I wanted to get to work back with corporate clients. And so that took me on a journey towards coaching and ultimately led me into executive coaching. And that led me to participate at a conference with the Institute of Coaching, which is affiliated with Harvard. And I started out really kind of falling in love with this community because they were very committed to bringing science and evidence-based to the coaching profession, which back then was still kind of in its early stages. And people would say, "You're a coach? What's a coach? Oh, do you do sports coaching? Or, what is that?" So getting involved with the Harvard Institute really helped me start to recognize the value of coaching, but also that there was research being done to look at the evidence base, that coaching can really make a difference if you follow and understand some of the science. So I volunteered, got active in that organization. And I'm a big fan, by the way, of anyone who wants career advice. Volunteer for something you are passionate about, and you never know what it leads to, because here we are many years later, and I'm the executive director of the Institute of Coaching. So today I spend my time leading the team of the Institute. We have a global network of coaches, and I have a leadership coaching practice, and I write books, as you know. So articles, books, it's been quite a journey, and I'm very grateful for everything that's happened.
It's a fascinating journey. Thanks for sharing. So let's turn to your new book, The Science of Leadership. You did some great studying, researching, synthesizing over 15,000 studies across 22 countries. Let's talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book, what it's about, and a little of what you distilled for its leaders.
Yeah, sure. First, a little background, which is that my co-author, Margaret Moore, and myself were both leaders at the Institute of Coaching. And we have been working together for years. We're good friends, but we are sort of two peas in a pod. She has a very strong science background. She was a biologist, and I have a psychology background since I was a psychotherapist. Both of us became coaches over the years. And we both have a very great deal of respect for the science that underpins effective coaching. And we also realize that most of our coaching colleagues that are in our coaching network are working with leaders. And as we have over like a decade been looking at the coaching science and translating the coaching science to help coaches become better, we realize that there's all this incredible research on leadership that is basically locked up in academia. You know, there's just thousands, as you mentioned, of really good research studies on what makes a leader effective. But how many leaders do you know that have time to read academic journals, to figure out which ones are relevant for them, to figure out how to put that academic stuff into practice? You know, I mean, it's just a hard slog. And Margaret and I had been doing that with coaching research for quite a long time. And so then we decided, we were in a conversation with our publisher, Barrett Kohler, and he was like, you know, the stuff you do for coaches, you should do for leaders. And we thought, you're right, that would really be cool. So that lent us on a journey basically to, you know, survey. I mean, leadership research goes back many, many decades, and we couldn't look at everything. But it did lead us to do a pretty deep dive into like the last 5 years or so of research. And then we pulled out what we consider to be most relevant for today's world. And some of it is very familiar to anyone. There's thousands of leadership books. So a lot of it will be names of leadership that you've heard about. Servant leadership, transformational leadership, authentic leadership. You know, it's not new. We didn't reinvent the field, right? But what we tried to do is a couple of key things that most leadership books don't do. Number one, we tried to really focus on the scientific principles of effectiveness and what has actually been studied and demonstrated to work. And there is good research. As I said, it's just hardly anybody reads it. So that was number one, is getting our arms around really good research. And then we're both coaches. So we took a coaching lens to this academic material and recognized that we want to make it accessible, because you can put out there in fact are quite a few academic books available, but they're really hard to read. And then even harder to use, because once you've got all that information, what do you do? But Margaret and I, at the end of the day, are really coaches that love research. So we tried to frame the book in a way that would actually be practical, accessible. We included coaching stories for each of the domains that we chose. We didn't try to cover everything, but we tried to pick those, what we call capacities or domains of leadership that are most relevant. And then once we had it kind of laid out, and there were 9 that we thought were really crucial, 9 domains, we looked at that and we realized that if you were a coach and you were trying to get your leader to develop the ability to work effectively in these 9 domains, they don't all come at once. It's kind of a journey. And that led us to sort of put them in a particular order. And as Margaret always says, you know, some of the researchers might not really be happy about what we did with it, because we were honorable to the research itself, but then we did kind of play around with the order, the priorities, because we're coaches and we were thinking about what's practical. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we sort of acknowledge that some of the researchers themselves might not be thrilled with the way we structured it, but we tried to honor them. And then we also realized that the audience is leaders. The audience is the folks that are actually on the ground doing the work. So we tried to marry the two. And I don't think we did a disservice to the research, but at the same time, we do want to acknowledge that some of the researchers might have a different opinion about the priority, or, you know, they think their research is the right research. So we may get some pushback from the researchers, but I think they would understand that what we were trying to accomplish is not to be like the world's compendium of research, but really pull those elements out that are going to be useful for day-to-day leaders and put them in a way with practices, coaching stories, that they can actually find value in it. So hopefully the researchers will be okay with that if they bother to read the book.
Tell us a little bit more about those elements and those 9 domains you mentioned.
Sure. I mean, the easiest way to step back and frame it is that we came to see, once we laid out the 9 capacities, as we call them, as the sort of core of the what makes an effective leader, kind of a lifelong journey to develop all these capabilities, we realized that they come in 3 flavors. So we framed the book in 3 dimensions. The first is to focus on the self. As a leader, you have to start with yourself. So the first domain focuses on consciousness, conscious leadership, authentic leadership, and agile leadership, which are really kind of internal capabilities. You develop your own skills, your behaviors, your awareness, and then you move towards the team. Obviously, you don't lead in a vacuum, you lead with others. So the second domain is the outer focus, and that involves relational leadership, positive leadership, compassionate leadership. It's starting to get into how do you interact effectively with others. And then ultimately, especially in today's world, the last 3 domains, which are in some ways the more sophisticated leadership capacities, you're stepping back and thinking about ways to lead an entire system or to lead an entire organization, and also become more aware of the downstream impacts of what you're doing as a leader. So you have yourself, you have the other, and then you have the broader system. And in that domain, you start to think about being a servant, because a servant leader is really working toward allowing others to start to step up. You become focused on shared leadership, because you want to share what you know and how to empower others. And then ultimately, you're looking for transformation. And transformation involves a vision with others. So the journey, you never really, I would call it a circle, it's not really linear, because you're kind of always going back. Sometimes you go back to authentic, sometimes you go back to consciousness, sometimes you go back to agility. So you never leave the early stages, but it is, for all of us as leaders, it's a lifelong journey to go through those domains.
So what did your research find on the difference between leaders who take this approach, this multidimensional approach to their leadership and their leadership style, and the results that are produced versus those who don't?
Well, I mean, almost every research study that you go and find in any academic environment where they're studying effective leadership will look at the results. And the results of effective leadership, as we point out early in the book, are really not about the leader. The leader may be great, maybe a really nice person, maybe authentic, maybe has really good traits, great personality, a lot of charisma. But in many ways, this is how the leadership science has evolved over the years. Because way back when I was a kid, or when I was in undergrad, when you think about leadership, it was focused on the individual personality. Are you a leader? You know, are you born a leader? Are you charismatic? Are you an extrovert? All of that, right? But the research shows that effective leadership actually is about how you impact others. And so when you study the effectiveness of a leader, what you're really looking at is the outcome of the team or the followers. And so the researchers actually they study what the leader does, but then they look to see how that impacts the followers. And good results show up when the followers are engaged. The team produces really good results. The organization is really successful. So the leadership research points in some ways away from the leader and toward the broader impact. And I think that's actually a really big shift, because it's less about me if I'm the leader and more about how do I influence, how do I impact others.
Yeah, that framing really does help shift how we think about leadership, right? From self to team to organization.
It also takes away the cliche that there are only a few leaders in the world, right? You're born one, or you're in the right place at the right time, or whatever it is, you have the right personality. The research shows that, and we really try to emphasize this throughout the book, that everyone has the potential to lead. Some of them are quiet, introverted leaders. Some of them are really charismatic, but that's not what makes a really good leader. There's a lot of other capacities or capabilities that make the difference.
Yeah, you covered a lot of ground, you and Margaret, in your research. And you also write that poor leadership costs U.S. organizations up to $360 billion a year. What's missing in the way most companies approach leadership then today?
Well, I think that the statistic that you just pointed out is very telling. And then the other one, and I won't necessarily get the most recent percentage, but the percentage of highly engaged people in work is way too low, like crazy low. And so if you think about human performance, let's analogize with a sports figure, someone who's Olympic level success, right? Nobody would argue that they are not engaged. Passion, commitment, struggle, hard work, practice. I mean, in order to be really, really superstar at something, you have to be highly engaged. So when the statistics show that something like 80% of the employees in the Western organizations in particular are disengaged, then there's something missing, right? And so that's really what I think points to the need to sort of really up our game as leaders. And there's a lot of good leadership books. There are hundreds of them. And many of them are very valuable. I've read a lot of them. I admire a lot of the really well-known leaders. But here's the rub. Those folks write a lot about their own story. Now, here's how I coached X company to be successful, or here how I started X company and we blew it out of the park. So they're valuable to be inspiring, but how much of that can you really take away if you're just an everyday leader running a team inside a big organization? Not everybody can be Steve Jobs. I mean, it's inspiring to read about those folks, but it doesn't give you the hands-on practices that you need. And that's what we really feel is missing, is to sort of move to a whole new level of leadership development, where some of this actual evidence that's been researched, as you mentioned in 22 different countries, so it's not just the US, some of that can be applied and make everyone a better leader. And then the likelihood of the people they work with being engaged and excited and inspired also elevates. And that's what we need today. We need highly inspired and engaged, excited employees, especially at a time when there's all this fear around AI is going to take my job. And, the last thing you need is anything that's actually going to demotivate people. You need to get the most out of your people. So that's our focus.
And, I want to just turn to those 9 leadership capacities you mentioned across those 3 domains: self, others, systems. Tell us a little bit about the self-oriented capacities and why you've put this as sort of a starting point.
Well, I think the idea that you have to be willing to step back and reflect on your own strengths and your own capabilities as a starting point is core. None of us is perfect. We all have blind spots. We all have good days and bad days. And we all have patterns. Everyone has, and sometimes other people see our patterns better than we do. It's the old adage, oh, did you see the boss today? You better not go by her office today because she's having one of those days. I mean, that's sort of typical. We're humans. So if you, before you can become transformational, or visionary, or any of the more advanced capacities, you really need to step back and think about yourself. And we call the ground on which that begins conscious leadership. And it's really about self-awareness and doing what it takes to actually become a little more objective about yourself. You'll never be fully objective. None of us are, right? But you can get a little bit of distance. You can get feedback. You can get a sense of what you're naturally good at and where you're kind of not so great at. You also can become aware of your, what we call shadows, or your bad habits or your triggers. And then if you can address those so that you become more grounded, more present, more aware, then you can move into those other domains from a different place, from a sense of centeredness. And then you can also leap into some of the more advanced ways of showing up very quickly. And I'll give you one example. Once you have a sense of the value of knowing that you're not perfect, and you're willing to own that with feedback from your colleagues or through some emotional intelligence assessment or whatever way you get that feedback, if you can integrate that, then you can actually be a little more vulnerable. And that humanity goes a long way. So you move, as you were asking me about these self-oriented areas, once you become sort of grounded in your good points and your not so good points, and you sort of are a little more aware of yourself, then when you move into authenticity, it's more real. Like, I know I'm not perfect, but here's what I really care about. And then when you go to share that with your team and you ask them what they really care about, it's much more likely to feel real. It's much more likely to feel trustworthy. Like you're not BSing. You're actually coming from a place of personal responsibility. So that's why those starting points are so important.
So then the move from self-leadership to systems thinking. How can organizations structure leadership development to help support that progression?
Well, the glib answer would be they use our book to go through 9 levels with their trainers. But yeah, I mean, I think that the most practical approach is to recognize that all of these domains of leadership that we've come to some of which we've come to recognize, like servant leadership or authentic leadership, they're all really valuable, but you can't learn them all in a day. So rather than be mishmashy about it, put it into a journey that goes from self, learn how to develop your sense of objectivity about yourself, learn how to understand your values and work with others around alignment of your values and the values of others, which leads to an authentic environment, a trustworthy environment. Learn how to be agile, which means a flexibility in your style so that you're not always bossy. Sometimes you're actually curious, and learn about the distinction between like highly productive versus creative. They're very different energies, right? So when you're developing leaders, focus on those areas and then move into relational. And relational leadership is really at the sort of heart of it all, being a coach, being a mentor, developing the ability to support others in a relational team dynamic, creating psychological safety. And I think what you do then is you start to have the ground from which you can ultimately step back and work towards a systemic, or what we like to call moving from an I to a we mindset. And that's when you get into the more sophisticated level in your development.
So for sure, building that kind of support structure is key for organizations, right? And now I just want to shift a little bit to this whole new era of AI and take
Okay.
on. as AI just becomes more embedded in businesses, decision making, how do you think it's going to change the role of a leader? And what skills will leaders need to keep up?
Well, the reality is that anytime there's a transformational technology on a macro level, it's very disruptive, right? I mean, whether it's the rise of the computer for those of us that are still young enough to remember that evolution, to the rise of the internet. There's a whole story, narrative that goes around it that the world's going to come apart and there's not going to be any jobs left and we're all going to be displaced. And so the doomsday scenarios are always going to be part of the fear reaction that we have to these new technologies. And there's some truth under there, because there will be organizational disruption. I mean, there are a lot of very rote day-to-day activities that will be taken over by these highly capable bots, or whatever you want to call them, whether it's literal robot or AI-driven bot in your computer or on your smartphone. I was talking to a friend the other day who's a lawyer. I have clients in the healthcare space. Those are spaces where AI is going to be infiltrating very quickly. Marketing, digital marketing. So the disruption is going to make the leadership skills of those that are involved in teams that are incorporating AI even more crucial. So all the skills you need to be an effective leader are just going to be heightened. And I think probably your biggest challenge as a leader, Margaret and I are working on an article right now called Becoming a Responsible AI Leader. And a lot of it has to do with actually doing the work that's in our book, but having a really heightened level of understanding the core humanity that needs to be reinforced. Because it's probably safe to say that there's some elements of being in the world that will not be replaced by machines. I mean, there's always the doomsday philosophers who say that AI will become smarter than people and then we won't even need to be here anymore. And, I'm not going to go there. I just believe that as a tool, AI can become incredibly powerful and it can be an enhancement. It can free up humans to be even more creative. But it won't unleash that creativity unless it's managed ethically, unless it's managed with a humane perspective. And so when you think about the systemic level of leadership, the transformational level of leadership, it has to include a conversation, because in some ways it really comes down to a conversation with your people. How do we incorporate artificial intelligence into our environment and do so in a way that enhances our creativity as humans? Like, that becomes such a core strategic question. We want to use these tools, we want to leverage them, but we don't want to lose our humanity. In fact, we want to get the best out of our humanity. It may mean that some jobs go away, but some new jobs get born. So, in fact, a lot of new jobs. I think Bill Gates is the one who said that, every time there's been a technological revolution and everyone thought the jobs would disappear, the reality is that a whole incredible abundance of new jobs appear. But that puts the onus on leaders to be part of that solution, right? Retraining people, helping people be less fearful, deciding how we're going to make that transition together. So it's a challenge, but the core principles of relational leadership don't go away.
Yeah. And out of the 9 leadership capacities that you cover, which one do you think will become even more critical in an AI-powered world?
It's always hard to choose 1 or 2 out of the 9 because they all have their place. But I would say maybe I would go from one end to the other. I would say becoming aware of yourself as a person is conscious leadership, in your strengths, how you trip yourself up, how you can be your own worst enemy, how you may be in what we call overdrive. A lot of the leaders we work with are in overdrive, where they don't stop, they don't breathe, they go from one thing to the next, they're constantly on their screens. So becoming that kind of objective aware person is really crucial. So I would call that, maybe it's the ground, it's the starting point, and it's probably never going to be less important than it is right now, more important than it is right now. And then maybe I jump all the way to transformational, which is, at the end of the day, if you really want to be a powerful leader, you need to be innovative, you need to be courageous, you need to learn how to get the most out of other people. And there's a section in our book, in the transformational leadership section, on inspiration. And that's actually been studied. There is a phenomenon, there's even a book about it called Awe. I'm forgetting the name of the writer, but the researchers have studied what are those aha moments when there's a breakthrough idea. And how do you create those spaces? That's transformational, right? So it's sort of from one end of the spectrum to the other. And not that we don't need everything in between, but to your question, I think in today's world, grounded, centered, and then truly innovative is probably the combination that would be crucial.
And finally, if there's one change you hope a leader makes after reading The Science of Leadership, what would it be and why now?
I think that one of the fundamental themes that we came away with in the book is, it doesn't have to be lonely at the top. You don't have to have the weight of the world on your shoulders. And so if there's any big takeaway, it's, yes, it's hard to be a leader in today's world. It is, there's no question about it. And there are actually quite a few that are not very good at it. I mean, we all know. But it doesn't have to be insurmountable. And you don't have to do it alone. So, take a look around and think of the people all around you as leaders also. And then that lightens the load a little bit, right? At the end of the day, if you can bring others with you and you can co-create the future, then it doesn't have to feel so stressful. Like, you can say, you know what? I trust you. You guys go for it. Let me know what you need. I'm here for you. And dollars and cents will have to go through whatever the nuts and bolts. But yeah, because I think a lot of leaders are. I have a lot of clients who call themselves reluctant leaders. Like, they're like, Jeff, I'm not really sure I want to do this job. I, in fact, had that same feeling when they asked me if I'd be the executive director of this institute. And it's a big organization in terms of like 5,000 members all over the world, but it's a tiny team. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure I really want, it's fun to be part of the team, but I'm not sure I really want to be that person in charge. But I had the same sort of wake up, which was like, oh, I don't have to do it by myself. In fact, it's kind of arrogant to think that I would be the person that makes all the decisions, or it really rests on my shoulders. So when I was able to step back and think, there's so much talent around me that, yeah, it can be fun. And then that shifts the energy, makes it less arduous. So I think that would be the big takeaway.
Well, that's great perspective, Jeff, and great insight. Great book.
Thank you
so much for joining us today.
No, I really appreciate the time.
Thank you. And we'll see you next time on Sartor TV.